Nicole Rich. I'm a student in PS408, Rebellion, Insurgency, and War, and today I'll be focusing on the biggest risk to international security within the global theater and suggested adjustments the U.S. should take to its applicable strategies. For the better half of the last 2 decades, the most concerning region within the global theater has been the Middle East. You have Al-Qaeda in Iraq, you have the Taliban in Afghanistan, you have ISIS spreading throughout the Middle East and expanding into Europe and Africa. And the US's typical policy towards these insurgencies are to solve all the issues at one time and call it the global war on terrorism. As noble as that is, all that does is spread our resources way too thin. We have too many objectives we're trying to accomplish at the same time. So if we bring it back a notch and focus on the one insurgency that's already happening but could be continuing for longer than anticipated, if we look back and focus just on this scenario, because it has the most implications on international stability, regional reformation, and the biggest toll on our assets and our international alliances, we might be able to better resolve this issue rather than prolonging it while trying to resolve several at the same time. So that scenario is the Syrian conflict. What started in 2011 as an uprising by the justifiably disgruntled population to overthrow the corrupt Assad regime, it's evolved into international coalitions and numerous insurgency movements butting heads and competing for the vacuum of power that will inevitably be there should the Assad regime fall. Because you have so many moving parts in one area and they're attracting the attention and the resources of major nuclear powers, the implications of the Syrian conflict, should it continue to progress in the destructive and violent manner in which it is, it has larger implications on the international community, particularly the US and its allies in that region, than any of the other high priority insurgency movements already catching the attention of the international community. So in the Syrian conflict right now, we have ISIS present, the Hezbollah is present. Iran is using this as yet another proxy to expand its own interests throughout the Middle East and eventually across the oceans and to take on a more global front. You have Russia doing the same thing as Iran, using this as another proxy to expand its influence and revive itself as a higher power within that region, all of which are trying to remove any sort of westernized influence from the Middle East beyond the US and Western Europe. So what started as a small community trying to overthrow a neglectful and corrupt government has now turned into a massive proxy war where all of these moving parts are trying to impose their own ideologies and take their claim of control to a contestable area that has significant influence in terms of connecting Europe and Asia and the Middle East. So by focusing the US's strategy less on expansive global war on terrorism and more towards one insurgent movement at a time, the US can better apply its massive resources and its international connections to gradually reduce the chaotic impact of all of these insurgent movements happening at once in one country. But more importantly, the US can funnel its resources and use its influence within the world order to help the people that are displaced because of all these competing ideologies who think they have what is in everyone's best interest. The major concern with the Syrian conflict is that it's resulting in the world's largest displaced community. So this is the biggest refugee crisis in modern history, and with all of these large power countries trying to achieve their own individual interests, we're forgetting that there's masses of people scattering throughout the neighboring countries of Syria, particularly in Turkey, which could have a drastic impact on our alliance with Turkey and could further distance any hope of achieving any stability in that region. given Turkey's history with Syrian forces. Um, Indicators of this moving towards an even more hopelessly chaotic scenario is the massive amount of people that are internally displaced and externally displaced. So, as we've analyzed throughout this semester, refugees and refugee camps are being used as weapons of war now in terms of insurgencies and extremist terrorist groups finding their niche in these displaced and uh, disheveled groups of people who are desperate for some sort of protection, some sort of stability, and some sort of guidance, which all of these groups are masters of filling those gaps that governments have not been able to. So these mass groups of displaced people are the first indicator that something is brewing, because those are the first place that these insurgent groups will go for recruitment, or something will stir internally in these groups to finally establish the stability that their previous governments just haven't been able to provide. The more devastated that these groups become, the more tension that is bound to brew between the countries that are taking on the burden of these refugees and then the distant countries like the US who can't seem to decide how they want to move forward with this scenario. So not only do you have numerous insurgent movements brewing within these refugee camps, now you have established state actors who are questioning their long-held alliances with major powers like the US or Iran and Russia, which could do who knows what type of damage to the international world order or how resources are allocated to the Syrian conflict. First things first is the U.S. needs to help address the massive refugee crisis that's resulting from the 4 ideologies and 4 extremist groups that are competing for a shot at Syrian governance. Recommendations, like I said, first things first, the U.S. needs to cease implying that ISIS has been defeated in the region, just like Nigeria is making the same mistake with the Boko Haram. The more that you are implying that you've defeated the target, the less attention, less resources, and less allocation that will be provided to that desperate region, providing that insurgent group to not only resurge with better tact and better strategy than before, but the continued neglect from external resources just drives the local population even more so to support that insurgent movement. So the U.S. needs to readdress that ISIS is not defeated in Syria, and it should steer its resources towards this one centralized location rather than trying to solve everybody's problems at once. Second, what we learned in waging warfare is that one of the key aspects to starving out an insurgency is eliminating its internal and domestic or external resources. So the U.S. has long played the game of swaying the international community towards one direction and away from another, and that's what it needs to continue to do in this scenario. It needs to make a multilateral approach towards isolating the Assad regime and suffocating it of any external support that it may be receiving from other members of the international community. Once its external sources are eliminated, then it's less capable of resisting the demands of the populace and the U.S. and its allies, which brings me to my final point. By focusing on reviving and reforming the socioeconomic infrastructures, the U.S. can provide the masses of displaced people with an opportunity to rebuild their lives the way they want, rather than coming in, taking out the opposition, and then hoping for the best. So if the U.S. channels its resources, its strategies, and its alliances towards providing opportunity to rebuild this mass of people's lives, then the Syrian conflict will likely be resolved. But you never know with the Middle East, so we'll see how things go.